Most beekeepers start their winter feeding in September or October. Sugar syrup, pollen substitute, top up the stores. It makes intuitive sense. Winter is approaching. The colony needs reserves. Feeding ensures they have enough to survive until spring. But the 1900s commercial producers in Ohio and Pennsylvania would have found that calendar wrong. Not in principle, but in timing. Because the physiological quality of winter bees is determined not in September, but in July and August, when the winter bee cohort is being raised. If adequate pollen is available in that window and Varroa load is low, the winter bees enter the cluster with the fat body reserves that a 6-month lifespan requires. If pollen is scarce in that window, or Varroa load is high, the colony enters winter with physiologically compromised bees, regardless of how much honey or syrup is stored above them. The September feeding that most beekeepers rely on as their primary winter preparation arrives 6 to 8 weeks after the biological window that actually determines winter survival has already closed. The 1900s producers who documented their winter management in the American Bee Journal exchanges of the period built their preparation calendar around that July and August window, not around the arrival of cold weather. This video breaks down the fat body biology that explains why the summer window matters more than the autumn feeding, the specific protocol those producers used, and why modern beekeeping's timing has been 6 to 8 weeks behind the biology for decades. The fat body is the physiological structure that separates a winter bee from a summer bee. And understanding precisely what the fat body does explains why the timing of its development cannot be compensated for by feeding in the wrong season. In a summer forager, the fat body is a modest structure in the abdominal tissue that stores limited reserves of protein, lipid, and immune compounds accumulated during the nurse bee phase. By the end of her foraging life, a summer bee's fat body is largely depleted. She has metabolized those reserves to fund the hypopharyngeal gland production, flight muscle activity, and immune response demands of 6 weeks of intensive colony labor. A winter bee's fat body is a fundamentally different structure in scale and function. It accumulates protein reserves, primarily vitellogenin, the egg yolk precursor protein that in worker bees functions as a protein storage and immune molecule rather than a reproductive one, during the nurse bee phase at a rate that reflects the protein availability in the colony during the weeks of that bee's development. A well-nourished winter bee enters the cluster with fat body vitellogenin reserves sufficient to sustain her through 6 months of clustering, to fund the hypopharyngeal gland production required for nursing the first spring brood in February, and to maintain immune function through the sustained cold of a northern winter. A nutritionally compromised winter bee enters the cluster already partially depleted. She will die before February in the coldest seasons, and will have insufficient gland capacity to nurse the first spring brood in the milder ones. The pollen availability window that funds fat body development in the winter bee cohort runs from approximately late July through mid-August in most temperate North American climates, the period during which the queens of well-managed colonies are raising the bees that will still be alive in February. The pollen sources available during this window vary enormously by region. Goldenrod, aster, and late wildflower mixes provide abundant pollen in some areas, while other regions experience a pronounced summer dearth that leaves colonies with minimal natural pollen intake through precisely this period. What the 1900s producers observed, and what the biology of vitellogenin accumulation confirms, is that colonies in pollen-scarce, late summer environments consistently produce winter bee cohorts with lower fat body reserves, weaker cluster performance, and higher February mortality than colonies with adequate late summer pollen access, even when both colony groups enter winter with equivalent honey stores. The honey is not the limiting factor. The protein is. A colony with 40 pounds of honey and nutritionally compromised winter bees will not survive as reliably as a colony with 35 pounds of honey and physiologically intact winter bees. The feeding protocol that addresses only the carbohydrate reserve, the syrup feeding of September and October, is solving the wrong nutritional problem at the right time of year. The correct nutritional problem to solve is protein availability in July and August, before the winter bee cohort's fat body development window has closed. The Varroa dimension of the summer feeding window is the component that elevates this from a nutritional management question to the central survival question for most contemporary apiaries. And it is the component that the 1900s producers were managing structurally, without the Varroa biology that explains why their protocol worked. A Varroa foundress mite feeding on a developing pupa during the capped brood stage suppresses vitellogenin synthesis in the adult bee that emerges from that cell. The effect is not subtle. Research published in the 2010 and confirmed by multiple subsequent studies shows that bees raised under high Varroa infestation during the pupal stage emerge with measurably lower vitellogenin titers than bees raised in low mite cells. The mechanism is the same as the nutritional pathway. The Varroa feeding event interferes with the fat body's ability to accumulate vitellogenin reserves during development, producing the same outcome as protein scarcity in the nurse bee workforce: a winter bee with reduced reserves, a shorter lifespan, and insufficient gland capacity for spring nursing. The July and August brood being raised under high Varroa load in an unmanaged colony is simultaneously experiencing the pollen scarcity of the summer dearth and the developmental suppression of Varroa feeding. Both pathways converge on the same outcome, and both must be addressed in the same window, not sequentially, not in autumn, but simultaneously in the 6 to 8 week period when the winter bee cohort's physiological quality is still being determined. The 1900s commercial producers who documented the summer preparation window were working without the fat body biology, without the vitellogenin mechanism, and without the Varroa context. What they had was decades of careful outcome comparison across their colonies and across seasons. The pattern they documented was specific. Colonies that received supplemental pollen feeding in late July and early August, in the weeks before and during the expected summer dearth transition, showed measurably higher late winter survival rates than unfed control colonies in the same apiaries. The differential was most pronounced in years with a severe summer dearth, when natural pollen sources were minimal through the critical window. In years with abundant late summer natural pollen, the supplemental feeding produced no measurable survival advantage. This conditional pattern, benefit only in dearth conditions, was itself diagnostically important. It told the producers that the critical variable was protein availability during the summer window, not protein quantity over the full season. A colony with excellent spring and autumn pollen access, but poor July and August pollen access, produced weaker winter bees than a colony with moderate year-round pollen access. The timing within the season mattered more than the seasonal total. This finding is the foundation of the summer preparation protocol, and it is the finding that modern beekeeping's autumn-centric feeding calendar has never adequately incorporated. The specific protocol that the 1900s Ohio and Pennsylvania producers applied in the summer preparation window had 3 components, applied in a specific sequence that the biology of the winter bee development timeline made non-negotiable. The first component was a mite load assessment, performed in the last week of June or first week of July, coinciding with the post-flow mite check described in the post-flow management video. If the mite load exceeded 3% at this assessment, immediate mite management was initiated before any supplemental feeding was provided. The logic was explicit in the producer's correspondence. Supplemental protein feeding in a high mite colony does not produce physiologically intact winter bees. The mite suppression of the vitellogenin synthesis during pupal development overrides the nutritional improvement from increased pollen availability. The mite load must be reduced first, so that the bees developing in the weeks following the mite treatment are raised in cells with both adequate nutrition and low Varroa feeding pressure. The second component was a pollen stores assessment in the first week of July, the same survey of the outer brood frame pollen arc described in the midsummer brood check video. If stored pollen was thin across 2 or more outer brood frames, supplemental protein feeding was initiated within 48 hours. The third component was the supplemental feeding itself, a pollen patty positioned above the brood nest in the proximity placement that delivers protein to the nurse bees raising the winter cohort, rather than to foragers at the entrance. The patty was monitored every 5 to 7 days and replaced when consumed through mid-August. The timing of the supplemental pollen patty, centered on the late July and early August window, is the component of the summer protocol that most directly distinguishes it from the autumn feeding approach that modern beekeeping instruction recommends. A pollen patty applied in September funds nurse bees that are raising bees who will emerge in October. October bees are not winter bees. They are the short-lived transitional population between the summer forager cohort and the winter cluster bees. They will not survive to February, regardless of their fat body quality, because they are raised in the declining population phase of the colony's annual cycle, and they emerge into conditions of reduced brood rearing, declining temperatures, and decreasing foraging opportunity that exhaust their reserves before the deepest winter months arrive. The winter bees, the bees whose fat body development determines February cluster viability, are the bees raised in July and August. Their nurse bees are drawing on the protein available to the colony in June and July. Their fat body development occurs in the pupal stage of July and August. A pollen patty applied in September arrives 6 to 8 weeks after the last cell of the winter bee cohort was sealed. The physiological quality of those bees was already determined before the patty was placed. The September patty is not useless. It funds spring buildup and late autumn colony health. But it does not reach the winter bee cohort. It cannot. Those bees are already adults by the time the patty is consumed. There is a specific objection to the summer pollen patty protocol that experienced beekeepers raise when they encounter it, and it is an objection that the 1900s producers addressed directly in their documentation. The objection is this: providing supplemental protein feeding in late July and early August stimulates brood rearing, which elevates Varroa reproduction, which potentially increases mite load at the exact moment the winter bee cohort should be raised under low mite pressure. If the supplemental feeding makes the Varroa problem worse, it may negate the fat body benefit it provides. The 1900s producers' response was the protocol sequence described in the previous section: mite management first, supplemental feeding second. The brood expansion triggered by late summer pollen feeding does not elevate Varroa load in a colony that has just received effective mite management. The mite population that would reproduce into the additional brood does not exist in sufficient numbers to cause significant pupal stage suppression if it has been reduced to below 1% before the feeding was initiated. The objection is valid as a standalone action. Summer pollen feeding without prior mite management can worsen the Varroa winter bee interaction. As the second step in the sequenced protocol, following effective mite management, summer pollen feeding improves fat body development in the winter bee cohort without the Varroa amplification risk. The sequence matters. Mite management first, supplemental protein second. Not simultaneously, not reversed, not as independent actions applied at different times. The historical documentation of the summer preparation window in the American Bee Journal record of the 1900s through the 1920s reveals a level of observation-based precision that the era's lack of molecular biology did not prevent the producers from achieving. One extended correspondence from a Pennsylvania producer, published across 3 consecutive issues in 1912, described his practice of assessing natural pollen availability in the colony's forage range during the last week of July each year. Not through hive inspection, but through entrance observation, watching the proportion of returning foragers carrying visible corbiculae during the afternoon return flights. When that proportion dropped below what he described as the summer baseline he had established for his apiary through previous season's observation, he initiated supplemental pollen feeding within 48 hours. He did not wait for the pollen stores survey inside the hive. The entrance observation was faster, required no hive disruption, and gave him a 1 to 2 day earlier warning of the transition into dearth conditions than the internal pollen arc survey provided. His winter survival data across the 12 seasons he documented showed that colonies receiving the supplemental feeding when the entrance trigger indicated pollen scarcity survived winter at a rate of 89%. Colonies in the same apiary in the same seasons that did not receive the summer supplement showed winter survival of 61%. A 28-point differential, consistent across 12 seasons, produced by a single management action applied in a single window. The entrance observation technique that the Pennsylvania producer used as his trigger for summer feeding, watching the proportion of returning foragers carrying visible pollen corbiculae, is a skill that requires calibration to a local baseline, but that, once calibrated, provides the earliest available external signal of the transition into the summer dearth. During a spring flow with abundant mixed pollen sources, the majority of returning foragers carry visible corbiculae. In most apiaries, this proportion runs between 40 and 60% of the return traffic during peak spring foraging hours. As the primary flow plants finish blooming and early summer pollen sources become more scattered, this proportion begins to decline. The decline is gradual at first, a few percentage points per week, and then accelerates as the colony exhausts its catchment of available summer pollen sources. The 2-week window between the first measurable decline in corbiculi proportion and the point at which stored pollen reserves drop below the adequacy threshold is the intervention window that the entrance observation technique opens. A beekeeper who watches the afternoon return traffic at 2 or 3 colonies for 5 minutes, twice a week, from early July through mid-August, will see this decline before it registers on the pollen arc survey inside the hive. The 5-minute observation at the entrance costs nothing. It opens a window that the hive inspection, performed less frequently and after the fact, does not provide. The 1900s producers built this observation habit into their summer management routine with the same discipline they applied to the morning robbing stand described in the dearth management video. Same principle, different biological signal, same proactive orientation. The downstream consequences of correctly applying the summer preparation protocol: mite management in late June, pollen supplementation initiated in late July when the entrance trigger indicates dearth onset, are visible in February in the same way that the midsummer brood check and post-flow mite treatment produce February outcomes. A well-managed summer preparation produces a winter cluster composed predominantly of physiologically intact bees with adequate vitellogenin reserves. Bees that generate sufficient metabolic heat to maintain cluster temperature through January and February, that survive to nurse the first spring brood in late February and early March, and that provide the nurse bee workforce that produces the forager pipeline for the following season's primary flow. The outcome looks like a normal, strong spring colony. It does not look spectacular. It does not look like anything that can be attributed to a specific July management action. And that invisibility of the causal connection is precisely why the summer preparation window has been so consistently undervalued in modern beekeeping instruction. The management action that produces the February colony is invisible in February. The February colony itself is the only observable outcome. Beekeepers who do not experience winter losses tend to credit their autumn management, their winter insulation, or their bee genetics. The 1900s producers who kept detailed seasonal records could trace the February outcome to the July decision, and their records consistently showed that the July decision was the primary determinant of the February result. 2 false positives must be distinguished from the genuine summer dearth signal before initiating the supplemental feeding protocol. The first false positive is the midsummer nectar dearth without a simultaneous pollen dearth. In some regions and some seasons, nectar availability drops sharply in July, while pollen availability from a different set of plant species remains adequate. In this scenario, the colony's foraging behavior changes. Reduced nectar returns, increased bearding from reduced internal space utilization, possible early robbing signals. But the winter bee cohort's fat body development is not compromised because the nurse bees raising those bees have adequate protein. Initiating supplemental pollen feeding in this scenario does not harm the colony, but it represents an unnecessary intervention. The distinguishing diagnostic is the pollen arc survey inside the hive. If the outer brood frames show solid, deep pollen arcs, despite the reduced entrance activity, natural pollen intake is adequate, and supplemental feeding is not warranted. The second false positive is the presence of available pollen sources that the colony is not foraging efficiently. Late summer plants that are available but not widely recruited due to declining forager population or reduced dance recruitment efficiency. In this scenario, a targeted hive move to a location within foraging range of the late pollen sources is a more productive intervention than supplemental paddy feeding, because it allows natural pollen intake of the full amino acid profile rather than the partial profile of commercial pollen substitutes. The specific failure mode of autumn-only feeding that the 1900s producers documented, and that the fat body biology explains mechanistically, creates a distinctive winter mortality pattern that most contemporary beekeepers attribute to the wrong cause. A colony with September and October syrup feeding, adequate honey stores, and no supplemental summer pollen arrives at February with adequate carbohydrate reserves and physiologically compromised winter bees. The bees are alive, but depleted. They generate less metabolic heat per bee than physiologically intact winter bees. In mild winters, the cluster maintains adequate temperature despite this reduced heat generation per bee, and the colony survives, leading the beekeeper to conclude that their autumn feeding protocol was adequate. In severe winters, the reduced heat generation per bee drops the cluster below the critical temperature threshold in January or February, and the bees cluster too tightly to break formation and reach the honey that is often within inches of them. They starve with stores present, the characteristic fingerprint of the autumn-fed but summer-deficient colony. The beekeeper finds a small cluster of depleted bees between empty frames, honey in the outer frames untouched, and concludes starvation. The actual cause was a winter bee cohort raised in July under pollen scarcity or high Varroa pressure, whose fat body reserves were insufficient to generate adequate cluster heat through the coldest weeks. The September feeding did not fail. It was never the relevant intervention. The relevant intervention was the one that was not performed in July. The summer preparation window is open right now, in late May and early June, in the weeks before the window that the 1900s producers identified as the critical protein availability period for the winter bee cohort. The mite load assessment that should precede the supplemental feeding belongs in this week, not in August. The entrance observation habit that provides the earliest external signal of the summer dearth transition should begin in early July and run through mid-August. The pollen patty that funds the fat body development of the bees that will still be alive in February should be deployed when that observation indicates the transition has begun, not when the calendar reaches September and the window has been closed for 6 weeks. None of this requires extraordinary skill. The mite assessment is an alcohol wash, the same wash described in the post-flow and midsummer videos. The entrance observation is 5 minutes of watching return traffic, twice a week. The pollen patty is placed above the brood nest in the proximity position that delivers it to the nurse bees raising the winter cohort. The 1900s producers who built the winter bee preparation protocol did not have fat body biology or vitellogenin titers. They had 12 seasons of careful outcome comparison and the economic pressure to understand why some colonies arrived at February intact and others did not. The biology that their observations mapped is fully confirmed by the research of the last 20 years. The window they found is still the correct window. Leave a comment with when you typically start your winter preparation and whether you supplement pollen in summer. And subscribe if this kind of historically grounded, biology-first beekeeping is what brought you here.